Imagine for a second the absolute smartest, most highly trained engineering minds of our generation.
Right, like the direct intellectual inheritors of the people who cracked the Enigma code.
Exactly. The people who built the first computers and, literally helped win World War II.
The absolute apex of human problem-solving potential.
Right. And what are they doing right now? Today, they're sitting in an open plan office in Silicon Valley, optimizing an algorithm to deliver a pair of socks 12 minutes faster.
Yeah, or building an app like Fizz or Snapchat just to, make people feel rich.
It's this wild, slightly absurd contrast when you put it in historical context.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it represents a profound shift in how we deploy human capital. We've essentially transitioned from cracking global cryptographic codes to, well, cracking consumer attention spans.
And that tension, that really specific, uncomfortable reality, is exactly what we are unpacking today. Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're diving into this highly controversial, incredibly aggressive vision laid out in a new book. It's called The Technological Republic: Hard Power, Soft Belief, and the Future of the West.
And this is by Alex Karp, the CEO of Palantir Technologies, and his deputy, Nicholas W. Zimiska.
Right. And their mission here is, honestly, it's nothing short of a cultural and economic shock to the system.
Yeah, they want to drag Silicon Valley out of what they call the consumer app tyranny and basically force a massive pivot into a new era of military defense tech and AI weapons.
Okay, now before we really get into the mechanics of how they actually want to do this, we need to make a promise to you, the listener, because the sources we're dissecting today are explosive.
Highly explosive.
Right. They feature highly polarized political arguments spanning from the far left all the way to the far right. So our job today is to be your neutral guides through this territory. We're strictly and impartially reporting the contents of these sources.
Yes, we are not taking sides.
We absolutely aren't endorsing any of these controversial viewpoints. We are simply trying to convey these ideas exactly as they appear in the original material.
The goal is just to map the territory for you. We want to explore the underlying logic of these arguments, understand what is being said, and figure out why it actually matters.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning, because Karp's central thesis is basically a giant indictment of his own industry. And he starts by dismantling this myth that Silicon Valley just loves to tell about itself.
He really does, because, we tend to think of the tech sector as this purely free market libertarian utopia, right?
Yeah, the classic couple of guys in a garage inventing the future, completely independent of the government.
Exactly. But Karp points out that Silicon Valley was actually birthed by massive government funding.
Like federal money.
Huge amounts. In the 1950s and 60s, the entire region was essentially fueled by the Pentagon and DARPA. They were building intercontinental rockets, military microwave tubes, radar components.
Wait, so the industry that currently prides itself on being, radically anti-establishment was basically created as a federal defense project.
That is the exact irony he highlights. The original customer was the Department of Defense. But the sources detail how that partnership completely fractured.
Because of the 60s.
Right. You had the counterculture movements, the Vietnam War, and just a growing cultural skepticism of government authority in general. So the tech talent pool shifted its focus.
Silicon Valley morphed into a consumerist hotbed.
Yes. And Karp argues that in the process, it lost its national identity and its sense of civic duty.
And he brings the receipts to back that up, honestly. The sources highlight the billions of dollars and millions of man-hours poured into companies like eToys, Zynga, Groupon.
Yeah, you literally have the greatest minds of a generation building Farmville.
Karp even takes aim at the holy grail of modern tech to make his point. He looks at the iPhone and asks, is this really our greatest creative achievement as a civilization?
Which is a heavy question. He argues that while it undeniably changed our daily routines, our hyper-focus on it is actually constraining our sense of what is possible. It limits our societal ambition to mere convenience.
Okay, but here's the thing. Why this sudden desire from tech billionaires to pivot away from consumer apps? Let's be honest, those apps print money.
They do.
So to jump straight from that into military defense feels like a massive out-of-nowhere leap. What is the actual catalyst here?
Well, the catalyst is pure geopolitics. Karp and Zimiska anchor their argument in the concept of the Thucydides Trap.
For anyone listening who isn't a military historian, this is the historical pattern where a rapidly rising global power threatens to displace an existing dominant power. Right?
Exactly. And it almost always results in conflict. They point to the rise of authoritarian digital empires, most notably China, as that rising power.
So the argument is essentially, if we don't build these advanced AI weapons, our adversaries absolutely will, and they probably won't lose sleep over the moral implications.
That's the core mechanism of his urgency. Adversaries aren't going to pause their research and development to host a seminar on the ethics of artificial intelligence.
Right.
If the U.S. doesn't launch what is essentially a new Manhattan Project to dominate AI weapons, autonomous drone swarms, and advanced targeting systems, the West risks ceding its geopolitical dominance completely.
But, I mean, dreaming up a new Manhattan Project is one thing. Actually convincing the public to go along with it is a completely different animal.
Mm-hmm.
Which brings us to how Karp actually pitched this to the world. And spoiler alert, the internet had an absolute meltdown.
Oh, it was explosive. To summarize the book's incredibly dense vision, Palantir decided to post a 22-point manifesto on social media.
And it racked up 21 million views almost instantly.
Yeah.
And when you actually read through these points, you can completely see why it went viral. It is this glorious absurdity mixed with a really shocking bluntness. For example, Point 6 demands that we seriously consider moving away from a volunteer military to a universal draft.
Yep, and Point 15 demands the rearming of Germany and Japan,
which would undo decades of post-war international policy.
It is essentially an attempt by a private tech company to dictate national policy on war, culture, and international relations in a single thread.
Wait, it's better. Point 21 literally claims that some cultures produce vital advances while others remain dysfunctional and regressive. Seriously.
It's extremely blunt.
What does this say about us as a society? That Silicon Valley elites are not only trying to dictate national military duty, but are openly ranking entire cultures on a hierarchy of worth on a social media app.
It definitely sparked a firestorm,
Right.
and the backlash across the spectrum was immediate. Again, looking at this impartially through our sources, we see a massive wave of condemnation.
Let's hear it.
Yanis Varoufakis, the prominent economist, quote-tweeted the manifesto and said, "If evil could tweet, this is what it would." He condemned it as a hideous ideology.
Wow, that is quite the book review.
And it wasn't just economists. The UK-based Labour Digital Rights Network pushed back fundamentally on the mechanism of power here. They argued that unaccountable tech monopolies have no democratic mandate to issue manifestos or dictate foreign policy.
Which is a totally fair point for them to raise. Like, nobody cast a ballot for a tech CEO to draft global military strategy.
Exactly the sentiment of French analyst Christophe Boutry, who described Karp's ideas as the privatization of sovereignty.
The privatization of sovereignty, that's a chilling phrase.
He's warning about the literal transfer of state power and decision-making into the hands of private corporations. Furthermore, the sources detail serious systemic criticisms from human rights groups.
Right, like Amnesty International.
Yes, organizations like Amnesty International have heavily condemned Palantir's existing surveillance tech. The sources note the company's tools power aggressive deportation tracking for ICE, and its AI infrastructure has been accused of feeding into kill lists and automated targeting systems utilized by the Israeli military in Gaza.
So, to be clear, we're just reporting what the critics and the sources are highlighting here. But to them, this manifesto isn't some patriotic defense strategy. It's a terrifying blueprint for a dystopian surveillance state.
They view it as an attempt to normalize intrusive algorithmic control over everyday life under the guise of security and hard power.
Okay, let's step back from the Twitter outrage for a second and look at the actual foundation of Karp's idea. Is his vision for this new techno-nationalist elite even historically grounded? Has America ever actually functioned this way, where private industry and national defense were locked together by a unified elite class?
It actually has, which is a really crucial piece of context missing from the social media debate. There's a fascinating piece in American Affairs by Tanner Greer that critiques Karp's book by looking backward.
Okay.
After the Civil War, America did have a techno-nationalist elite. They were known as the Eastern Establishment.
Right, so we're talking the guys with the top hats, the railroad monopolies, the early steel barons?
Yes, but the key to their power wasn't just wealth. It was how deeply and materially invested they were in the national project. I mean, they literally built the transcontinental railroads that stitched the continent together. There are incredible stories, like men such as J.P. Morgan personally funding Army pensions during a federal budget shortfall just to make sure Union veterans got paid.
Wait, really? He literally floated the government payroll out of his own pocket.
He did, but here's the underlying mechanism of why that worked, which Greer points out. The Eastern establishment built their solidarity through intense, shared physical institutions.
Like what?
Well, they fought together in the Civil War. They built the Union League clubs. They sent their kids to the same elite boarding schools, like Groton. They intermarried.
So they had ultimate skin in the game. I mean, if you're listening to this, imagine your entire social circle, your family and your business partners, all being inextricably tied to the success of the country. If J.P. Morgan failed the nation, he wasn't just facing a corporate fine. He was facing social exile from his own community. Modern Silicon Valley has no equivalent social mechanism tying them to the nation's success.
Exactly. They were a unified class with a shared moral framework and a deeply ingrained sense of physical consequence. And this is where Greer dismantles Karp's modern solution.
Because Karp's solution to save the country from what he calls technological agnostics, these tech workers who don't seem to believe in anything, is just to make college kids read the Western canon again.
Yes.
Like, hey, read some Plato and suddenly you'll want to build defense software.
Yeah.
So Karp wants the Avengers, right? This unified, powerful elite to swoop in and save the world. But his only training plan is a college book club.
An incredibly expensive book club, yes. Because Greer points out the fatal flaw in Karp's logic. Karp correctly diagnoses the problem, that Silicon Valley lacks a shared moral roadmap or values. But his fix is essentially just a reading list. He wants a new ruling class to build the weapons of tomorrow, but he refuses to actually articulate what that class should believe in other than just building things for the government.
Which brings up a massive, highly practical roadblock. Even if Silicon Valley elites all read Plato, joined hands, and wanted to build this stuff, is the United States government actually capable of partnering with them to build a new Manhattan Project?
That is the multi-billion-dollar question. And the Independent Institute review of the book provides a really strong skeptic's view on this. They critique the fundamental mechanism of government-led innovation.
Because it's notoriously bad, right?
Historically, yes. Public partnerships often massively misallocate capital. They centralize risk and shield companies from the actual pressures of the free market, which is what usually drives true innovation.
I know they give a few historical examples. Let's look at the Atomic Energy Commission. How exactly did that break down?
The Atomic Energy Commission is a perfect example of government failure. They had the top PhDs in the country and seemingly infinite government funding to research nuclear power reactors.
Sounds like a recipe for success.
You'd think. But they operated like a bureaucracy. They picked a few highly complex, non-viable reactor designs and poured all their resources into them, completely ignoring market signals. Private firms, meanwhile, had to actually worry about cost and efficiency.
So they went a different route.
Exactly. The private sector pursued different, simpler designs like light water reactors, and the private sector completely overtook the government's projects and won the market.
Okay, but what about GPS? Because I use GPS every single day. That was a massive government win, right?
Well, it originated in the government, yes, but the government's instinct was to hoard the capability. For decades, they purposefully kept it terribly inaccurate for civilians.
Wait, on purpose?
Yes. They utilized a program called selective availability. The mechanism of this program intentionally degraded civilian GPS accuracy by roughly the size of a football field, so only the military had pinpoint data.
Think about trying to use Google Maps a day. If it only knew your location within a football field, you'd be driving into lakes.
Exactly. It wasn't until the year 2000 that the government finally deactivated selective availability. And the moment they let the private sector actually use the precise data, it unleashed the worldwide commercial revolution we know today.
And if we're talking about the government's ability to buy and manage tech, we have to talk about military procurement. It is a legendary, decades-long nightmare. Remember the infamous $435 hammer from the 1980s?
Oh, yeah. The Department of Defense was caught paying $435 for a standard, everyday claw hammer. And the why behind that price tag is pure bureaucracy.
Let me guess, lots of paperwork.
Exactly. It wasn't made of gold. It was because the military required massive, hyper-specific custom documentation, testing, and contractor overhead just to buy a tool you could get at a hardware store for $10.
Yeah.
It led to absolute public outrage over the sheer insanity of military spending.
And that outrage actually led to a real law. The 1994 Federal Acquisition Streamlining Act. It basically said, hey, government, if a commercial product already exists in the private sector, just buy it. Stop paying contractors to build a custom $400 hammer from scratch.
But the reality is the government largely ignored that law for decades. The culture of wanting bespoke, custom-built, overly complicated systems was just too entrenched. And this is where Palantir actually pulled a massive power move that perfectly illustrates the dysfunction.
Yes, I love this part.
In 2016, Palantir literally had to sue the U.S. Army.
I love that this exists, but also, why? You're trying to sell them software, so your sales tactic is to sue them. That is simultaneously impressive and completely ridiculous.
Well, they sued the Army specifically to force them to adhere to that 1994 law. The Army was trying to waste billions of taxpayer dollars to build an inferior custom intelligence software system from scratch. Palantir sued to force the Army to at least consider buying Palantir's commercially available, already functioning software.
And Palantir won the lawsuit.
They did. But the fact that they won is almost secondary to the sheer absurdity of the situation. It shows how deeply broken the partnership mechanism is if you have to take your own client to federal court just to force them to look at a working product.
Precisely, which naturally leads to the next question. If the government side is that deeply culturally broken, how does a company like Palantir suggest we fix organizational dysfunction? Like, how do they run things internally to avoid this kind of bureaucratic paralysis?
This is where Karp's philosophy moves from geopolitics into some truly quirky corporate culture territory.
Quirky is an understatement.
It is, but the underlying mechanics of it are fascinating. To model their corporate culture, Palantir studies flocks of starlings.
The birds?
Yes, the birds. When starlings fly in those massive murmurations, those sweeping cloud-like formations in the sky, they don't form spheres, they form flat disks. And here is the crucial mechanism. The movement of the entire flock is led by the birds on the edge, not by a central leader in the middle. The edge birds are the ones who see the predator first or see the food first. They react instantly, and that reaction ripples through the flock without a boss having to issue a directive. They also study honeybees for the exact same reason, to model leaderless, rapid collective intelligence.
So they want an organization that adapts instantly to threats, which explains another wild detail from the sources. When new employees join Palantir, they aren't handed a standard corporate compliance handbook.
Yep.
They are given books on improvisational theater.
Right, and think about how improv actually works. The core rule of improv is yes and. You never reject your partner's premise, you build on it. By ingraining this in their engineers, Palantir is trying to bypass the traditional org chart.
Yeah, you don't want people saying no.
Exactly. When an engineer spots a problem, middle management isn't allowed to say, no, that's not your department. The culture forces them to say yes, and how do we solve it?
It plays directly into this concept the sources mentioned called shadow hierarchies.
In a traditional company, your authority comes from your job title on an org chart. A shadow hierarchy is the exact opposite. Your authority comes from actually doing the work and solving the problem. You don't wait for permission from a vice president. You step up because you, like the edge bird in the flock, have the direct information.
The book refers to this behavioral trait as constructive disobedience, which, again, I'm disobeying you constructively, is hilarious, but the numbers actually back up this kind of chaotic energy.
They really do.
The sources note that founder-led companies, which tend to maintain these weird, idiosyncratic, highly aesthetic cultures, have a 10.7% higher annual return than non-founder-led companies.
Because they prioritize the vision and the rapid execution over middle management consensus. But of course, Palantir is a private company. How do we apply this rapid reaction mindset to the government?
Right, because the government is the ultimate bureaucracy.
Karp actually has a highly specific and very expensive suggestion for that. He argues that if we want better government, we have to treat public service like a hyper-competitive capitalist market. We have to pay government officials private sector wages.
Okay, let's look at the numbers on that because the disparity is wild.
Take the chairman of the Federal Reserve. This is a person who manages trillions of dollars, dictates interest rates, and effectively steers the global economy. They make around $190,000 a year.
Which, to be clear, is a lot of money to the average person.
Mm-hmm.
But in the high-end finance world, that's what a 22-year-old entry-level analyst makes right out of college.
Exactly. To fix this, Karp points to the Singapore model under their founding father, Lee Kuan Yew. In Singapore, the philosophy is entirely different. Government ministers make over $1 million a year.
Wow.
The underlying mechanism here is that you peg their salaries to the top earners in the private sector. You treat governance not as a civic sacrifice, but as the most important corporate job in the country.
The idea being, if you want the absolute smartest people running the country, instead of optimizing algorithms for SOC delivery, You have to pay them what the open market dictates they are worth. Otherwise, public service just becomes a hobby that only the already wealthy can afford to do.
Exactly. It's an attempt to align financial incentives with national survival.
So, synthesizing all of this, the historical context, the military urgency, the deeply weird corporate culture, where is this all heading?
Pulling from all our sources, we are basically looking down the barrel of three possible futures for the West. Scenario one is corporate-led innovation. This is where tech giants just rule everything. They build the AI, and the traditional government fades into the background as an obsolete bureaucratic middleman.
Okay, that's one.
Scenario two is authoritarian digital empires. This is where centralized states, like China, successfully merge absolute state power with cutting-edge AI and completely dominate the globe.
And scenario three.
Scenario three is what Karp and Zamiska are aggressively lobbying for: a Western technological renaissance. This is a future where democracies actually manage to reform themselves, cut the procurement red tape, leverage their brightest minds, and build the AI necessary to maintain hard power and protect their values.
And achieving that third scenario requires redirecting all of that incredible engineering talent we talked about at the very beginning of the show. Which brings me to a final thought I want to leave you with as you go about your day.
Yeah.
Let's say Karp gets his wish. Let's say we actually succeed in pulling off this cultural pivot. We redirect our brightest, most creative minds away from art, away from consumer joy, away from convenience, and we put every single one of those brilliant brains into building an impenetrable fortress of AI weapons, kill lists, and surveillance networks to protect the nation.
Right.
If we do that, do we risk creating a perfectly secure world that has absolutely nothing joyful left in it to protect? Are we just guarding an empty room?
That is the ultimate paradox of building a technological republic.
It really is. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.